Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
Our theme for the last year and a half has been the history of Jewish ideas about God to help you work on your own ideas about God in davening. We're in the middle of medieval, and we've been talking about mysticism. We had a few weeks on Zohar, which is mysticism part one. Kabbalah part one. And now we're going to do Kabbalah part two, which is ideas about God from the Kabbalah of the Ari. He's generally called the Ari. Aleph Resh Yud, which stands for Ha-Eloki Rabbeinu Yitzchak, the divine Rabbi Yitzchak. In English, he's called, different things. Sometimes he's called the Ari, but his name technically was Rabbi Isaac Luria. And he's also, you'll see it written in English, also called in Hebrew, the Arizal. Zal, Zion Lamed is Zichro Livracha, his memory for a blessing. So he's called Ha-Ari or Ha-Arizal or Rabbi Isaac Luria. They're all the same people. Okay, same person. He lived in the 1500s in Tzfat, Safed, Israel. Let me talk a little bit about that moment in time and why that's significant. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and also Ferdinand and Isabella kicked out the Jews. The Jews had an incredibly flourishing civilization on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, for, more than 500 years, probably 500 to 600 years. And remember, the Spanish Peninsula was divided between the Muslims and the Christians. And the biggest flourishing was in Muslim Spain, but there was also flourishing in Christian Spain that produced great works of poetry, literature, et cetera, great communities. And then I don't know all the history, what they call the Reconquista, when the Christians reconquered the entire peninsula of Spain and kicked the Moors out, as we refer to the Muslims in Spain. And at some point, under the reunited Spanish kingdom, Spanish Christianity became more what we would call in today's terms religiously intolerant, and did not, whereas in Muslim Spain, there were Jews, Muslims, and Christians living together. Once Christian Spain reconquered the whole Iberian Peninsula, at a certain point they became very intolerant of other religions, and Jews were forced to convert or leave. Right? The Spanish Inquisition, the origin of people called the Marranos, which we now call them, we don't use the term Marranos anymore. The term is conversos, some of whom ended up, as far away as New Mexico and places like that. But that's the story of why Jews came to the New World entirely, because they were fleeing what had been this incredible civilization on the Iberian Peninsula. So they fled. They went to Amsterdam. They went to London. They went to the Mediterranean. They went to the Balkans. They went to Spanish and Dutch colonies in the New World. And that's how we ended up with Jews in the Western Hemisphere originally. So 1492, when generally the year we give for the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. This was, that's my capsule of history. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but I'm not a major history guy. So that's what I know. I've just told you everything I know about that. This was incredibly traumatic for the Jews, devastating. I don't know. Here's an analogy. Jews have flourished in the United States between Israel and, I just read a statistic yesterday, between Israel and the U.S. Israel and the U.S. together contains something like, I don't know, like 90 to 92% of the Jews in the world today, between 90 and 95%, right? Half are in Israel, maybe more than half in Israel, a little bit less than half here. We think of ourselves, Jews in America, as this great, incredible, flourishing civilization. So imagine if we were told all American Jews need to either convert to, I guess it would be Christianity, or leave, okay? And the United States all of a sudden became, sorry, use an obscene term, Judenrein, free of Jews. Imagine how traumatic that would be to us, okay? We would see we had this long, great civilization, everything from Judah Benjamin to Larry David, right? And it all comes to an end. We thought we were in this great place. We were free to live as we wanted. So this was extremely traumatizing for the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. It was seen as a major cataclysmic event for them. For them, it was probably the most devastating thing since the destruction of the temple in the year 70, destruction of the Second Temple. And around then, again, I'm fuzzy on years, the Ottomans conquered the Mamelukes and took charge of the Eastern Mediterranean lands, Ottomans being Turks, and they welcomed the Jews into their kingdom. And this is how Jews got to be in places like Salonika, Greece, and Bulgaria, and Rhodes, and Turkey, and Jews newly moving to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. Now, Jews had always been in Israel, but now there were more numbers coming in, and a town began to flourish that hadn't been much of a place before, and this is Tzfat, today's Tzfat or Safed. Okay, so that was 1492. In the 1500s, there were circles of great rabbis, many or most of whom were mystics in the town of Tzfat. The Ari was one of them. Now, the Ari has disproportionate influence. He only lived in Tzfat for, I think it was 3 or 4 years, very short amount of time, and he died very young, 30-something, and he never wrote anything down. Like a lot of rabbis who never wrote anything down, their disciples wrote it down. His main disciple was a guy named Rabbi Chaim Vital, so everything that we have that's written by the Ari was really written down by Chaim Vital. There were other mystics there. Lecha Dodi on Friday night emerges from that circle. Lots of customs that we have emerge from that circle. The person who we remember in the main Jewish thought lineage, the name that we associate with that is the Ari, even though there were other mystics there. And even though the Ari himself wrote virtually nothing and was there for a relatively short amount of time and died relatively young. But all the mysticism of Tzfat is generally, unless you're like a scholar who delves into different writings, we associate it all with the Ari. Now, the fact that this magnificent Jewish civilization in Spain had been destroyed is what most scholars say lies behind some of the thinking of the Ari. This was seen as a great cataclysm or destruction, and it is reflected in the Ari's thought about God and the universe. Again, he didn't say this. This is what historians say after the fact. It seemed to these people that the world was, to use a non-technical term, seriously out of whack. Okay? And the Ari, developed or articulated ideas about God in which religiously the divine realm and the divine role in the universe is seriously out of whack. In other words, the Ari's theology reflected, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, their experience of life. Okay? And again, it would be as if, I don't know, all American Jews were kicked out or forced to convert, and some of us went to, I don't know, Madagascar or New Zealand or something like that. And we had shreds of our civilization, and we sort of were trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. Everything seemed to be okay. We knew we were in exile from Eretz Yisrael after the destruction of the temple, but we lived sort of stably in exile, hoping for the Messiah to come, and we're doing our rituals, and everything is kind of stable and okay. And then all of a sudden, things are unstable and fundamentally damaged. So scholars say that was kind of their day-to-day life historical experience of the world. And this is reflected in the Ari's thinking about God, which we're going to get to in a moment. As I prepared this class, in the back of my mind is the question of Larry. But how does this relate to our davening? And I'm not entirely sure of the answer. We'll find, you guys will mull that over. But the Ari is an incredible thinker, an original thinker in the chain of Jewish mystical tradition, which comes down from the Kabbalah of the Zohar, which we talked about for several weeks before our break, through the Ari. He's the receiver of that. They all studied Zohar, and he kind of changed some of those ideas. And then this chain of thinking gets down to Hasidism, which were the heirs of the mysticism of the Ari. And I think ideas in Hasidism are very important to us in our davening, potentially. And so some of what I'll cover today, you might say, I don't know how this works in my davening. But he's an important, I'm going to say, chain in the link of tradition of the evolution of Jewish ideas about God. And that's why we can't skip him. And that's why he's seen as a seminal figure. Because of Larry's question, how does this fit into davening? You know, I sort of try in my own davening to say, well, does this fit anywhere? So I haven't worked it out for myself, but maybe some of you will. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to attempt to screen share. Now let's share the screen. Okay, you see writings? Yep, okay. So this is from a contemporary book, Finding God, published out of the Reform movement, which is sort of a history of different Jewish ideas about God. And most people who write briefly about the Ari, briefly means a chapter that's like 10 pages or less that people like you and me could understand without delving into deep scholarship, will say that the Ari had basically three ideas about God that were new and original. Okay? The first is the idea of tzimtzum, tzadi yud mem, tzadi vav mem, tzimtzum, which means contraction. Litzamtzem still means in contemporary Hebrew to contract or to shrink. Okay? So the Kabbalah taught us that God flows through the sphirot, the aspects of divinity, if you remember of that from the Zohar, to fill the whole world. And for the Ari, this left a logical problem. If God fills the whole world, if God is everything, well, omnipotent and omni this and omni that, and fills the whole world, then how can you or me actually exist? Because I'm not God and you're not God and the table is not God. So how does anything exist that's not God? And by the way, and we may come back to this idea, in the Zohar says that God surrounds the whole universe and fills the whole universe. Okay? It's kind of a little paradox or tension. Well, surrounds the whole universe, that I understand, that's basically Maimonides' idea of God is outside the universe, right? And wills the universe to exist. We talked about that at some length. But if God fills the whole universe, how is there room for the universe if God fills everything? So the Ari said, God wills because God wants the world to exist. And I understand some of this may sound like, I don't know, to some people, theology, mystical theology sounds like gobbledygook. To other people say, oh my God, this is so inspiring and elevating. I have no idea what camp you will fall into, or somewhere in the middle. I think I'm somewhere in the middle, by the way, right? So he said, God, through God's own will, I have to admit, Michael, could you admit them? God decided to contract oneself. God took a little half step back, an inch back in God terms, so that God did not fill the whole universe, so that there was empty space, vacuum in the universe, and that gave God's a space to create the world. Okay? God voluntarily contracted oneself. So step one is God made God's self smaller, in air quotes, whatever that means, so that there'd be room for stuff. And then God wanted to create the universe, and God emanated God's self, which is metaphorically conceived of as beams of light, right? Mysticism uses all sorts of metaphors for God spreading light, breath, right? Just think of the breath in chapter 2 of Bereshit. God breathes God's breath into Adam, okay? So here it's light. So God sent out light into all the stuff that God created in the universe. And the Sefirot, the 10 aspects of God, had manifested. God had manifested in the universe. God poured light into them. And some of those vessels that God had created to receive the light couldn't handle the divine light. God was too much for them, and they broke. Okay? And this is part 2 of the Ari, Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. God the infinite poured some of God's infinite light, or God's self, into the universe, into, let's call it, physical things, okay? And some of them could not handle the light. They couldn't handle the godliness, and they broke. They shattered. It's called the breaking of the vessels. A lot of times you'll see it written as the shattering of the vessels. And what that means is, just as if you were to pour water into a glass and the glass shattered, what would happen to the water? You would have little droplets of water all over the place, okay? And you would also have little pieces of glass with little droplets of water on them. That makes sense physically, right? So his theory was, we have all of these broken vessels in the universe, which have a little drop of godliness in them. And then somehow, and again, the metaphor of how this works, not entirely clear, these vessels, these little pieces of stuff, I will say, close up around the droplets of light. And these little things are called husks, Husk, like a husk of a coconut. And that Hebrew word is klipot, which is the same word in modern Hebrew to mean a husk or a peel of something. L'kalef means you peel your orange or your apple. So the world is filled with little droplets of God that are contained within or covered up by balls of schmutz. Just like the husk of a coconut, it's something that conceals what's inside, that is obscuring what's inside, which is what you want, is the coconut flesh or the coconut milk. And you have to open it up and get rid of it to get to what's inside. So the world is filled with, I don't want to say pieces, let's just say aspects of divinity in everything. And that means people, that means rocks, and it means people, it means everything. And all these droplets of divinity are obscured, and they are an artifact of essentially a damaged universe. The damage is that the stuff in the universe was unable to contain the divine light that was poured into it, and so everything is shattered. There are drops of divinity in everything and everyone, and they're all covered over. So naturally you could probably figure out what the third element of the Ari's theology is. What is the role of human action? The role of human action is to find the sparks of light in divine light, that which means the shreds of divinity in everyone and everything, and to peel away the husks, remove the husks, so that the light can be reconnected with God. And God can't do that. We have to do that. That's our job. That's our role as human beings. So the world is filled with divine light. I'm going to take a step back to abstract that, because he has the mythic story. Mythic, it's sort of like a Greek myth, which sounds very concrete, meaning it's a concrete story way of expressing abstract ideas. So the myth is God contracted to make room for the universe. God pours God's lights into the universe. The universe couldn't handle it. The vessels broke. Okay, so the droplets of godliness spread all over the place. They become covered up by klipot or husks. Okay, and it is our job to remove the husks and find, release, liberate the droplets of godliness, because the universe needs to be mended. It is fundamentally, now I'll come back to the beginning of what I said before the theology, it is fundamentally out of whack, okay? And we're the only ones who can bring it back online. I'm mixing metaphors. And we're the ones who have to gather up the scattered pieces of light and liberate the little pieces of godliness from the husks. So whereas before, by the way, there's always been debate in Jewish messianism about what will bring the Messiah and the Messianic era. Are we supposed to do something, or will God just decide to bring the Messiah and we're just kind of passive waiters, waiting for the Messiah? Nothing we can do. In Lurianic Kabbalah, Lurianic is the adjective in English, in the Arizal's Kabbalah, human action is essential, because bringing of the Messiah basically means restoring all the fragments of light, and the only ones who can do that are us. And how do we do that? Just to finish this thought in the Ari, by doing mitzvot with a particular intention. Okay? And this is called tikkun, which means repair. Okay? And here our author calls it, we are co-partners with God. Just to take a step back to Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking, everything being out of whack. What that also means is, in somewhat more elegant terms, everything is in exile. God is in exile because God voluntarily decided to do tzimtzum, contraction. God poured some godliness into the universe. All those sparks of God are in exile, and it is our job to work to end galut, or exile, by doing mitzvot. Now, you'll hear in this echoes of stuff from before, like, the rabbinic idea followed up in Kabbalah that there's an aspect of God called the Shekhinah, God's presence, which is in the Zohar is the 10th and lowest sphira, or aspect of God, and that's the aspect of God that's present in the world. And the rabbinic idea in the Midrash that when we went into exile, we being the children of Israel, people of Israel, the Shekhinah goes into exile with us also. Okay, so you will hear in this idea, the Ari didn't invent this out of nothing. He really, stood on the shoulders of people before him and developed it further. So again, the historians of this say that the idea, their experience was a world that was broken or fundamentally damaged, and the Ari formulated a theology, a set of ideas about God that reflected this sense of damage or dislocation. The universe that we live in is fundamentally broken. Now, remember, the Zohar said that also, but the Zohar said that had to do with the ripping apart of male and female, which were originally together, And the Zohar has a lot about the sin of the Garden of Eden. There's a lot we say, we Jews like to say, oh, we don't believe in original sin. The Christians who believe in original sin, well, I have news for you. The Zohar totally believes in original sin in the garden, and that's why we're sinful, right? So, the Zohar also, well, let's just call that Kabbalah phase 1, okay, which we talked about before the break. Zohar also had ideas that the universe is fundamentally damaged. This is a different version of the damage of the universe, and it also really centralizes our role, all of us. Now, you'll also, just to prefigure here, foreshadow, the heirs of these ideas are the Hasidim, okay? And who are the Hasidim who are around nowadays? What is the Hasidic dynasty that takes this third idea really, really, really seriously? Chabad, okay? If you do one mitzvah, if you put on tefillin today, or one Jewish woman lights Shabbat candles, okay, you do one mitzvah, you are actually helping to mend the universe, okay? So their theology is a direct descendant about this as filtered through Hasidism. We'll get shortly, like not today, but maybe in a week or two, to Hasidism and how Hasidism filters it in, okay? So 3 ideas. Tzimtzum, God contracted God's self. Shvirat HaKelim, God wanted to pour divine light into everything. Everything would have divinity in it. The world couldn't handle that, and things broke. So there are sparks of divinity everywhere, right? By the way, a lot of thinkers about how this gets articulated a little later on in Chassidut talk about the difference between pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism means everything is God. Panentheism means there is God in everything, okay? And the kind of maybe one root of Jewish panentheism is this idea of Shvirat HaKelim. God's light was poured out, and everything contains a droplet of God in it. And it's our job to liberate that and free that. And when we do that, we are doing tikkun, and we are mending the world, which is to say, here we go. Here's a nice line on the second page. Second paragraph, by doing mitzvot, we can free the imprisoned divine lights, raise them to their proper places, and restore the world. Therefore, an individual who performs a mitzvah is not only doing the right thing, but is also contributing to the mending of the entire universe. The future of the world, it's a pretty heavy sentence. The future of the world is therefore in our hands. We are co-partners with God in this divine and sacred task. It's not that the adults have left the building, but there are things that the adults can't do. We have to do them, okay? And then the Messiah symbolizes the completion of the redemptive process, which is our job. Now, I will leave a few minutes for questions. Now, I want to point out to you how this actually translated into prayer. And this is the part of the whole story which is, for many of us, less appealing. I'll use that term. Less accessible. Because I feel like everything I said up until now, people say like, yeah, I got that, There's divine, sounds pretty contemporary. There's a divine spark in everything. And it's our job to find that divine spark and liberate it. And that helps redeem the world. Like when I put it that way, you would say like, oh, I think I've heard that in a zillion sermons, right? Well, this is where it comes from. The Ari takes it someplace that you might not have expected. So he says every mitzvah you do, you have to you can't just be a robot. You have to have intention that you're trying to liberate the godliness in it. This intention is called a kavanah. You've heard that word before too, right? You're supposed to have kavanah when you daven, which means intention, which means you're not just a robot body robotically saying words. You're actually having intention. And here's where the Ari took it to. And this is where the Ari's thinking has an impact on davening, but in a way that most of us will not find accessible. Okay. Here's a version of a Siddur according to the Ari. There are various things that are printed nowadays called the Siddur according to the Ari. This is the one published by the Kabbalah Center, okay, down the block on Robertson. All right. Kavanat Hashma, the intention of saying the recitation of Shema. Okay? So you have to have all of these. And so first, the little print is not, notice, here's the Siddur, right? Baruch Ata Hashem, Habocher B'Amo Yisrael B'Ahava, right? Okay? So here's the intention of the Shema. You have all these rules. Oh, by the way, there's all these phrases. You're supposed to have this particular intention for each one of those words when you say the first line. And then every time God's name is mentioned, you're supposed to have some kavanah, or we know there are many names for God in the Kabbalah, in the Bible, and the Kabbalah, the Zohar, mapped 10 names of God onto the 10 Sefirot. We talked about that just a little bit, right? So every time you come to a name of God in the Siddur, whether it's Adoshem or El or Elohim or Elokei or Hashem Tzvaot, you're supposed to have a particular different intention of what that means. And here God's 4-letter name, where's my cursor? There it is, which is pronounced Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yud. You're supposed to have this intention of this 8-letter name. Notice this 8-letter name, which looks like Yah Adonai, is Yud, then Hey, and then Vav, then Hey, God's 4-letter name, interspersed with the way we pronounce it. Aleph, then Daled, then Nun, then Yud. And if I had something that said Elohim in the Ari Siddur, it would have a different little thing. Okay? So you're supposed to have intention of what these names of God mean. And here's the Shema. Oh, and look, and on every word in the Ve'ahavta, there are 42 words. There's a mystical 42-letter name of God. And on each word, you're supposed to have the kavanah of that particular letter. Okay? All right? So I just brought you one example, the Shema. So before you say the 6 words, you're supposed to have a certain kavanah. Then you have to have certain kavanah intention for each one of the 6 words. And then each time you name God's name, you're supposed to have a particular intention. Okay. And you're supposed to have an intention on each one of the words of the first paragraph of the Shema, one of the letters of the mystical 42-letter name of God. And the Great Revolution, just to foreshadow, is the middle of the 1500s. Okay. The Great Revolution of Hasidism, which arises about 150 to 200 years later. Baal Shem Tov was born in, I think his years are like 1700 to 1748. So the rise of Hasidism is in our late colonial times and revolutionary times. Okay, the Baal Shem Tov just before, right? And then his next generation, which really started to spread Hasidism. Let's think, I always say, just think of it as in the middle of the 1700s as we're getting ready for the American Revolution. The Great Revolution of Hasidism, just to foreshadow, was it basically said, no one can do this. This thing that the Ari said you're supposed to have when I do a mitzvah, I'm supposed to have the particular kavanah, and let me tell you how the kavanah is done. This is the name of God, this is the letters, this is what I'm supposed to be thinking of. You know what? Maybe there are some spiritual adepts who have all day long, who have studied all this stuff, who can do this, in air quotes, correctly, the way the Arizal thought they should. But regular folks, you and me, no one can do this. No one can have these kavanot for the Shema and for every single mitzvah that they do. Okay? So forget about it. And we'll actually see some of the writings of the Baal Shem Tov where he says, yeah, you should do it with the kavanot, but if you can't, Baal Shem Tov being the founder of Hasidism, if you can't, forget about it. Then just forget about it. Okay. So I'm going to try to summarize that. The Ari, because I think we're going to move forward next week. The Ari had some fundamental and revolutionary ideas about God. The way he translated those ideas in a specific way into the Siddur ended up being extremely complicated. Again, it was he or his followers who wrote it down at the school, ended up being extremely complicated. It ended up being so extremely complicated that for most Jews, I'm foreshadowing now, it ended up being a dead end. All right? You can buy the Siddur of the Ari. Is there anyone, are there people on the planet who are working to have the Kavanot that are printed in the Siddur? I guess probably. I don't know any of them, and I'm pretty sure you don't know any of them. And it ends up in a system that feels very unwieldy if you follow the Ari system all the way through. And the great revolution of Hasidism is it said, take the theological ideas, pretty much throw out the practical application as the Ari himself conceived of it, but have a different application. Okay? And they talked about much more general kavanah rather than you have to do some, I know it sounds like I'm being pejorative when I say mumbo jumbo, but that's what it seems like to most of us, do mumbo jumbo with letters and combinations and thought like that. By the way, there are other Jews in the mystical tradition who also had their own system of word and letter mumbo jumbos. You meditate, if the 22 letters of the Hebrew language is the code of the universe, then 2 and 3 letter combinations, all the possible combinations, if you recite them all, it's like, every possible combination of, electrons and protons, and you have the building blocks of the universe. So if you meditate on that periodic table of Hebrew letters, then you understand the foundations of the universe. So there were other mystics who had all sorts of ideas about what we would call meditative letter mumbo jumbo, which, was impossible for regular people to grasp or do, and which ended up being a dead end, even more of a dead end. At least the Ari Siddur is published. There's a guy named Abraham Abulafia, and I think the 1300s in Spain, who had a whole mysticism based on meditating on Hebrew letter combinations. And it, scholars know about it, but regular people don't know about it because it was just a dead end. No one was actually able to practice this form of meditation. Okay. The same way, by the way, in Eastern religions, there are adepts, spiritual adepts who devote their whole life to mystical meditative practices. But most people don't do that. They don't go live in a cave. And we also know that Judaism, this goes back to, kind of the friction between rabbinic Judaism and early mysticism, and rabbinic Judaism, mainstream Judaism, frowned on that. You shouldn't be spending your whole life doing mystical combinations of letters. You should daven and then go to work and build the world and support your family and play a meaningful role in life, like being a shoemaker or whatever it is. Okay. So there are some of the ideas of the Ari. There is godliness in everything, but it is somehow obscured. It's our job to recapture, unveil those aspects of godliness and help repair the world. That stuck, and the Kavanot didn't really stick. I mean, it's still you can still buy a Siddur that has the Kavanot of the Ari in it, and you could spend the rest of your life, I think, studying it and trying to figure out how to do it. And the vast majority of people don't do that. So the practicalities of how to do it, that really didn't stick in the meeting. Okay, I'm going to pause. I'm sorry, it's 8:59. Let's just take a couple of minutes for questions or comments, if there are. Larry, you had a hand up quite a while earlier, and then you put it down.
Yeah, I was going to comment on this business of Tzimtzum, but I don't really want to comment on that. I don't have any meaningful comments except you called it mumbo jumbo.
I didn't mean to be pejorative. I apologize.
I want to be pejorative. No, okay. I want to be pejorative. I call it shtuyot, and I call it. But the thing that you revealed to me that I hadn't really thought about.
Yeah.
And maybe maybe you don't want to even discuss this, or maybe it takes a different direction. Is from what I can tell, the Ha'ari. No, that's the Ari or Ha'ari.
Yeah.
Made this up out of, if not whole cloth. So he got it from somebody who made this up from whole cloth. And we like to think, some of us at least, at least my practice of what I think is modern form of somewhat traditional Judaism, that there's some sort of connection going all the way back to the earliest writings in the Tanakh. And now what I'm saying is that that's not true at all. And what's considered to be acceptable.
I'm going to stop you. Sorry, I'm going to stop you because I understand the question. I have to respond. So many scholarly books have been written about what are the roots of Jewish mysticism. And there were Jewish mystical books published before the Zohar. Zohar is in the 1290s, so the Jewish mystical books from the 1100s. And there's a lot of scholarship on, and I'll basically tell you two schools of thought if I could just radically separate them. One is that this was something that was radically new. And they talk about, was this influenced by Christian mystics? Did things migrate over from Eastern religion through Christianity or the Sufis? That's one school of thought. And the other is, no. There was subterranean Jewish mystical knowledge that was always there. The Zohar, I think you could make the same claim about the Zohar, okay? The Zohar says it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century of the Common Era, a Tana. And there are many traditional Jews who believe that, okay? So the traditional view was always there was a subterranean Jewish mystical approach that was not taught to the masses, that was not written down, that was esoteric, meaning it was for the very few. It was not exoteric. EXO is not meant for the masses. It was actually considered dangerous. How do we know that? The Mishnah and Tractate Chagiga. 4 scholars entered Pardes, paradise. Only one of them came out intact, Rabbi Akiva. One died, one went insane, one converted out of Judaism, right? So they look at this Mishnah to say, yes, people studied esoteric material. Okay, I don't have time to get into this longer. I'll finish up in a moment, Rabbi Schatz. People studied esoteric material. They only studied it orally. They did not write it down. It was seen as dangerous only for a few adepts. And don't worry your pretty little head about it. Just, go daven and then go out to your work as a shoemaker. Okay? And that it's only with the rise of written Kabbalah in the 1100s and the Zohar in the 1200s that for whatever reasons this starts to be written down. So I just want to say, Larry, there are 2 points of view on that. Okay? And even for the first point of view that it's new, I want to point out there are roots of this. God, Melo Chol Haaretz Kevodo. God fills the whole world. Okay? That's in Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. It's in Isaiah. All right? Baruch Kevod Hashem Im Kamo. God infuses blessing from God's place. But where is God's place? Does God have a place? Okay? God appears differently to different people at different times. The Shekhinah goes into exile with us. Okay, so many of these ideas do have their roots in rabbinic Judaism. I want to make an argument. Something like light is poured into vessels and the vessels break. I will grant you that. I don't know what the root of that is in rabbinic Judaism. But I do want to argue with the idea that it's all made totally out of whole cloth. It's an evolution, and then there are moments in it that are revolutionary. And yes, some of the Ari's thinking is revolutionary.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.